Okay, to get started today, I want to do a quick survey. How many of you would consider yourselves a fairly observant person? If you'd say, yeah, I'm a pretty observant person, I tend to notice things, just go ahead and just kind of raise your hand, all right? Raise your hand. All right, I raised my hand, but the truth is, I'm not the most observant person in the world. In fact, on more than one occasion, Sue will come up to me, my wife Sue, and she'll say, hey, you notice anything different? And that is like the scariest question in the world, isn't it, guys? I mean, when your wife says, notice anything different? Because what you have is you got about 5 seconds to answer, and you got to be right. You remember that feeling when you were in grade school and you'd show up and the teacher would say, put your stuff away because you're about to have a pop quiz. And then panic comes all over you. Well, this is kind of like that, except it's the marital version of a pop quiz. And I've learned that the two best answers are just either blurt out, new haircut or new outfit. But the truth is, there's really no right answer to that question, because notice anything different? By the time they ask you, notice anything different, if you haven't already noticed that something is different, it's really too late. I suppose I should have noticed, but I didn't. So actually, the best answer to notice anything different is just to really kind of cut to the chase and just kind of apologize and say, I'm sorry, honey, I should have noticed, I'm an idiot, I don't know how you put up with me. That's the best way to do it. And the truth is, I'm not really always that observant. In fact, it was funny. One time, Sue and I went over to some friends of ours. They live up in Geneva. Jim and Julie is their name. And while we were there, I noticed a print on their wall. And I remember telling Julie, I said, oh, Julie, I really like this picture. And my wife, Sue, says, well, you should. And I was like, why? She said, because we gave them that picture. True. And that's not all. Then Sue says, and secondly, because we have the exact same print in our house. I don't know. Not always very observant. Now, I want to try something, and I want to see how observant you are. What I'd like to have this half of the room over here. Let's just go right over you, this half over. Everybody just stand up. Go ahead and you just stand up. All right, go to your feet. Very good. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to look around at the other half of the room. Just look at all the people over there. All right, now what do you see? Just go ahead and look around. Make a mental note of what you see. You got it? Okay, if you got it. All right, good. Now you can go ahead and sit down. Go ahead and have a seat. All right, now I'd like to have this half of the room. This half of the room, you all stand up. Go ahead. You can just stand up to your feet. Very good. Very good. Now it's your turn. What I want you to do is you look around at this half of the room. Look at all the people over there and just, what do you see? What do you observe? Go ahead. Make a mental note to yourself about what you see over there. You got it? All right, good. Now you can go ahead and have a seat. All right, thank you for participating. We're going to come back to this later on at the end. Now, one very quick and easy observation I can make about the whole room is certainly this, that we're all sitting in rows. We're all sitting in rows. You're all facing forward. You're all listening very intently. You're all looking at me. And don't you wonder how we got to the point where we almost always sit in rows in church? I got a little bit of a theory. I don't know. We'll see. I think it's partly because most pastors love rows. I mean, in some ways, pastors kind of make their living by rows, right? Pastors like to speak to people sitting in rows. And in fact, the more rows that we fill, the more successful people assume that we are. Filling rows can be kind of a scorecard. And if a pastor can get people to fill up enough rows, it's also easier to take up an offering, right? Now for me, I like rows, but I love circles. We're starting a brand new series simply called Circles. And the reason I love circles is because of an observation I made as I read about the first church that Jesus left behind. It seems that almost everything good that happened in that early church and through that early church took place in circles and not really rows. In fact, let's take a look at what the Bible says about that first church and see what you observe. We're going to read from Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47. It says, they devoted themselves to the apostle teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. And all the believers were together, and they had everything in common. They sold property, possessions, to give to anyone who had need. And every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. And they broke bread in their homes And they ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Now, as we read these verses, I think we can all observe that the early church, well, they may have assembled in rows. It says that they continued to meet in the temple courts. But if we look a little closer, we see that the first Christ followers lived most of their lives actually in circles. It says they broke bread in their homes. They ate together. This is a group that shared life in community. They were together. And what we see here in this text is in at least 4 ways they did life in circles. The description of the early church begins with kind of this wholehearted devotion to God. But you can't miss this part, but also a relational kind of dedication to each other. In verse 42, it says they devoted themselves to apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and also then fourthly to prayer. Now notice their pursuit, their devotion. It wasn't this kind of solitary individual activity. The early church knew that their relationship to God was not something pursued or even experienced all alone. No, they were devoted to learning together, spending time with one another, celebrating communion together, praying together, teaching, prayer, fellowship, eating together. Sounds an awful lot like a circle to me. I grew up in a church where we did a lot of kind of just sitting in rows. In fact, our church had pews, and pews are just kind of long wooden benches that ensure that everybody sits in a row. That's where I first learned about the teachings of Jesus. But you know what I remember most? I think what really impacted me the most through my church days growing up as a kid, it was probably circles. I remember being in 5th grade. I was a part of a small group of boys who met every week during, we called it Sunday school. I remember we had a teacher named Mr. Walrath. He was a funny guy. He made us laugh. He had a way of making us feel important. He would teach the lesson. We'd also talk about whatever we wanted to talk about. And every week, we sat our chairs in a circle. We learned to pray in that circle. We learned lessons about Jesus in that circle. And as I look back on kind of those days, and then even through junior and high school, it was that circle and other circles that made sure that I think even today that I'm a follower of Jesus. And by the way, that's exactly what your kids in Kids City and your students and student community experience. Circles. A circle where Jesus is known, a circle where they connect with one another, a circle where they learn how to find their way back to God. Circles, I'm telling you this, circles are better than rows when it comes to growing spiritually. Circles are also better at meeting physical needs. Now, if we go back to Acts 2, again, we observe, if we look at verses 44 and 45, it says, all the believers were together. They had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had a need. Now, this isn't a forced kind of sell your property to give to the poor type of community. Not at all. It wasn't a cult. This first century church lived in such a way, they willingly made those decisions to make sure everyone's physical needs were taken care of. What would that look like in our world today? Well, maybe it's simple things like running an errand for someone who's sick or in need, or snow blowing someone's driveway, or mowing their lawn because maybe physically they're in a situation where they can't do so. It might mean making a meal for a family that's dealing with a crisis. It might be driving someone to a doctor's appointment because they can't. See, circles allow us to know and meet the physical needs of those around us, as well as have our own needs met. And it's so easy not to know or even notice others' physical needs when we sit in rows. I sit looking at the back of your head, and you look at the back of somebody else's head. But when you sit in a circle, you have to look somebody else in the eye. When you sit across from someone, you can hear and you can see what they need, and they can see and hear what you need. Circles. I'm telling you, circles are better than rows when it comes to meeting one another's physical needs. And it's not just spiritual and physical. Circles are also better than rows when it comes to providing emotional support. Did you know research proves, it actually proves that circles are better than rows. And I love it when research proves what God established long ago. I wonder if God's up there going like, I told you so, when new research comes out. Well, PBS commissioned a study to better understand the relationship between relational kind of connection and happiness. Out of the research, they produced a documentary called The Emotional Life. Now, here's a quote from that documentary. It said this: Researchers have found that people are happier when they are with other people, happier than when they are alone. And there's a boost is the same both for introverts and for extroverts. So it's not really a personality thing. It goes on to say, they also are finding that happy people are more pleasant, helpful, and sociable. So being around other people makes us feel happier. When we are happier, we're more fun to be around, creating this upward spiral of happiness. I love that image. What a great image of how a circle works, this upward spiral of happiness. Because I think all of us, we've also heard of depression causing a downward spiral emotionally. But circles, not rows, circles lead to this upward spiral of happiness. That's why it says in Acts 2 about those first Christ followers. Look at verses 46 and 47. With glad and sincere hearts, praising God, enjoying the favor of all the people. Circles, they lift us emotionally. Circles are better than rows at giving us emotional support. So it's spiritually, physically, emotionally. And there's one more way that circles are superior. Circles are better at accomplishing the mission of Jesus. The last sentence in our passage from Acts, verse 47 says this, and the Lord added to their number daily those who are being saved. For the last several years here at Community, we've seen on average at least one person a day find their way back to God and getting baptized. And when someone's baptized, we always have them kind of write out their story so we can share their journey to encourage others. And when we hear those stories, I'm telling you, the vast majority of those stories, the people who find their way back to God here at Community, those stories will inevitably include something like this. I want to thank my small group. Or I asked my small group leader to baptize me. Or they'll list a name of people, or they'll name a group of people close to them that influenced them, in a powerful way and impacted them spiritually. Sitting here in rows, it can be helpful. It can help a lot. But when it comes to helping people find their way back to God, my experience, circles are better. There's another reason circles are better at accomplishing the mission. It's in circles that the rest of the world gets to see us live out these, what the Bible calls one another's. There's actually 59 times in the New Testament the phrase one another is used. We're encouraged to accept one another and serve one another and be patient with one another, forgive one another, encourage one another, pray for one another, offer hospitality to one another, and ultimately to love one another. And we do that best in circles. Jesus said this. He said, by this all men will know that you're my disciples, that you're my followers if you love one another. And I'm telling you, that happens best in circles. I remember I was doing an internship in Southern California. This is still in college. It's getting close to graduating. And I heard a guy speak by the name of Juan Carlos Ortiz. He was pastor of one of the largest churches in South America. And he told a remarkable story about what happens when a church breaks out of its rows into circles. Ortiz's church was this kind of energetic and fiery Pentecostal church. And on this particular Sunday, the people were singing out with kind of this passionate energy. And the prayers they were saying had this tone of a charismatic kind of fervor. And of course, the people were all sitting in pews. And they were sure that the Spirit of God was there and Ortiz was getting ready to deliver the message. The text for that week was right out of the Bible. Ortiz had prepared the talk. He was getting ready to remind the people one more time the importance of loving one another. And he spent a lot of time praying over this message, carefully crafting every thought. And he believed that God really had guided him all along the way to deliver this particular message. So as he approached the stage with kind of confidence and boldness about this message, he said something happened about halfway from his seat to the podium. He heard a voice kind of in his spirit say, Juan? And he really felt like it was God. And so in his own mind, he said, yes, Lord. And he felt like God was even asking, how many times have you preached on this passage to love one another? And he's getting ready to talk, and in his mind he's thinking, I don't know, maybe a dozen, maybe more. And as he was about to step in front of the people to speak, he heard the same kind of voice in his own mind and his spirit say, did any of those sermons do any good? Ortiz said he suddenly realized he had the wrong message, and he kind of stood frozen still. He looked over the congregation all sitting out there in their rows. He looked at the people, some he'd helped become Christ followers, some that he had counseled, some that he'd visited in the hospital. He saw people who had heard the same message taught over and over and over again, but he knew they still struggled to live it out. And suddenly all thoughts evaporated from his mind. He stood frozen in time as his congregation waited to hear some words of inspiration. Well, finally, he just spoke up and he said this. He said, "Love one another." And then he walked back to his seat and he sat down. The people just sat there in kind of motionless silence. And this was a Pentecostal congregation where, they could handle fiery preaching and, passionate praise, but they weren't really sure what to do with kind of silence and still. Well, Pastor Ortiz stood up and he walked up to the podium one more time. And again, he said the same thing. He just said, "Love one another." And he said he went back to his seat again. He said this time heads began to turn from side to side and people began to look at one another with kind of a questioned look in their eyes. They began to kind of appear silently asking each other, "What are we supposed to do?" People were shrugging shoulders, eyebrows were raised. There was kind of this bewilderment on everyone's face. Well, again, after a couple of minutes, Ortiz left his seat, walked to the podium, positioned himself very carefully, and then very deliberately, a little more force, said, "Love one another," and went back to his seat. After a few moments, a guy stood up in the congregation and said, "Brothers and sisters, I think I understand what Pastor Ortiz is talking about. He's asking me to love you." And as he said this, he pointed to a family sitting in front of him. "But how can I love you when I don't even know your name?" And the man proceeded to introduce himself, and he asked the family next to him the same kind of question, hoping discovering ways in which he could get to know them and love them and express love to them. And then another man stood up and said, "I understand what Pastor Ortiz is saying. He wants me to love Carlos, who was sitting, 3 rows actually behind him. And how can I love Carlos when I'm holding this grudge against him?" And so that man left his seat and he approached Carlos and he apologized, and the two were reconciled. And well, with this, suddenly kind of the floodgates opened up and people got up and began to circle amongst themselves. And they began to ask each other what they could do for one another. And that Sunday, he said incredible things, just incredible things in retrospect happened. There was actually a husband and wife who'd come to the city seeking medical treatment for their little girl. They didn't have enough money to return home. Someone purchased a bus ticket for them to get home. Another young man was looking for a job. He was introduced to a man who owned a business and needed an extra person. And the young man got a job. Ortiz made this comment. He said, "While all this was going on, I was just sitting in my chair praying and watching one of the most powerful messages I've ever delivered in that church." And he would tell you that church was never the same after that worship service. And what did he learn that day? It's this: circles are better than rows. I'm telling you, I am absolutely convinced that loving one another and connecting, it happens best through circles that here at Community, we just call them small groups. And let me be absolutely crystal clear. I want everyone, for all the reasons we've already talked about, to join a small group, to be in a small group. See, as our church began, it began as a small group of friends, and then it became a group of small groups. And we believe that none of us will ever experience what God meant for us to experience and be what God meant for us to be without authentic biblical community. And that comes through a circle called a small group. And over the years, I've been in lots of different groups. And those people, when I think back on those people, have been some of my best friends. When Sue and I got married, it was people in our small group. They danced with us. When my daughter, my 2 sons, Amy, Josh, and Clay, when they were born, it was people in my small group who came to the hospital to visit us, who gave gifts to us, and they celebrated with us. When our marriage struggled, it was people in our small group that told us we could get through it and prayed for us. When we were sick, or if the kids were sick, it was our small group that made meals for us. It was a couple in my small group that taught me when I was in my 20s how to budget, how to save. There was one couple even who they gave me $50 every month just to get me started on saving. It was people in our small group we would vacation with. It was small group peeps that watched our kids, when we traveled. It was people in my small group that loaned me a car when mine broke down. You're probably thinking, I don't want to be in that guy's group. He works you to death. No, it's just that those are the people that when you're in a circle, you start to love each other. Let's go back to our opening question. Are you observant? This half of the room over here, let me ask you, what do you see in that half of the room? What do you see over there? Okay, now this half over here. What do you see in that half? Now, if you said a new haircut or new outfit, nice try. But if you said they're sitting in rows, well, that would also be correct. But maybe what you didn't notice, because we're all in rows, is that those people over there are people that need you. And I'm telling you over here, you're going to need them. And same thing with you over there. Those people over there, they need you. And you're going to need them. And every one of us, we need a circle of people through the power of the Holy Spirit that together they will get us through anything that this life brings us. Anything. And so here's the challenge we have for you today. And the challenge we're going to give you this entire series. I love showing up here and having you in rows. But join a circle. Get in a small group. You need people. And there's also people that need you. And rows can be good. But circles are better than rows.